She thought she was coming home to love. Instead, she walked straight into betrayal. After 10 years of carrying a marriage on her back financially, emotionally, silently, she returned early from a business trip with one simple plan: surprise her husband, cook dinner, feel like a wife again. But in the parking garage, one detail stopped her cold. A familiar car, parked in her space. A car that should never have been there. What followed wasn't a screaming match, no shattered plates, no dramatic confrontation. It was something far more dangerous, because when a woman who has built empires realizes she's been played, she doesn't explode. She calculates. Behind a quiet smile, she begins collecting evidence, videos, messages, money trails, lies stacked on lies. And when the affair involves not just another woman but blood, every move becomes surgical. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about restraint. About patience. And about what happens when the person you underestimated decides to stop forgiving and start finishing things. The rain has started without warning, the kind that turns city streets into mirrors and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Her Uber slowed as it pulled into the underground garage, tires hissing against wet concrete. She watched the numbers on her phone tick down. Another project finished early, another contract closed ahead of schedule. 10 years of grinding had trained her to treat wins like routine. Still, tonight felt different. For once, she wasn't rushing back to another meeting or hotel room. She was going home early. No announcement, no hints. Just a quiet surprise waiting behind her front door. She imagined his reaction already, the smile, the relief, maybe even gratitude. She'd cook something real, not the takeout boxes that had slowly replaced dinners together. It was a small fantasy, but it warmed her more than the expensive coat on her shoulders. As the car stopped, she pulled her suitcase out, the wheels echoing sharply in the concrete space, and then she froze. Because parked neatly in her paid private spot B15 was a cherry red Mustang, flashy, careless, completely out of place. She stared at it longer than necessary, her mind instinctively reaching for logic. Maybe it belonged to a guest. Maybe someone had made a mistake. But the license plate erased that hope. She knew it. She'd seen it countless times at family gatherings. It belonged to her sister-in-law. And that's when the questions began stacking up, one on top of another, heavy and unavoidable. It was a weekday. Her brother-in-law was supposed to be supervising a construction site outside the city. Her sister-in-law should have been at work or anywhere but here. Why her building? Why her space? Why now? A faint chill slid down her spine, the kind you feel before bad news arrives. Still, she corrected herself. Don't jump to conclusions. You're tired. You've been traveling too long. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she was dropping something off. Families overlap. That's normal. She repeated that word silently, normal, as if saying it enough times could make it true. But even as she dragged her suitcase toward the elevator, the sound of the wheels screeching through the empty garage felt louder than it should have, like a warning she couldn't quite translate yet. Inside the elevator, the stainless steel walls reflected a version of herself she barely recognized. Tailored suit. Perfect posture. Eyes dulled by exhaustion she never talked about. 35 years old, and she looked like someone who had aged quickly, not from time, but from responsibility. 10 years earlier, she'd been softer, lighter. Now she was the backbone of everything. The career, the house, the stability everyone else leaned on. She wondered briefly and painfully whether her husband even noticed the cost, or if, to him, she was simply reliable, predictable, useful. The elevator chimed on the 18th floor, and the hallway greeted her with silence. No music, no voices, no warmth. She smiled faintly, already planning how she'd sneak in, how she'd stand behind him and watch his face when he turned around. She didn't ring the bell, didn't knock. Her finger brushed the biometric lock, and it opened with a soft click that sounded almost like a sigh. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn, air thick with lavender, her scent, familiar, comforting, except there was something else beneath it. A note she didn't recognize. Sweet. Foreign. Her hand tightened around the suitcase handle. She slipped off her heels quietly, placing them by the door. The apartment felt wrong in a way she couldn't yet explain, too still, too expectant. She took a step forward, ready to call his name, when a sound stopped her mid-breath. At first, she thought it was the television, then conversation. Then she realized it was neither. It was breath, heavy, broken, a woman's voice, strained and unmistakably intimate, tangled with a man's low, familiar rhythm. Her body reacted before her mind did. Muscles locked. Blood surged, then vanished, leaving her cold and burning at the same time. She didn't move. Couldn't. Seconds stretched into something unreal. Slowly, silently, she approached the bedroom door, which had been left slightly ajar. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway, enough. Just enough. On the bed she had made before leaving, on the sheet she had chosen, two bodies moved without restraint. And the woman there was no confusion now was her sister-in-law. The betrayal landed not as a scream, but as a hollow thud, deep in her chest. In that instant, something fundamental shifted, not just love, not just trust. Something colder took its place. And as she stood there, unseen, one truth became clear. This wasn't the moment she lost control. This was the moment she gained it. She didn't rush forward, she didn't gasp. She didn't cry. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She stood perfectly still, as if her body had decided to shut down every unnecessary function to survive the shock. The sounds behind the door continued, unaware of her presence, unaware that a life was quietly fracturing just a few feet away. Each breath she heard felt invasive, not because of what it implied, but because of what it erased. 10 years of shared routines, inside jokes, silent understandings. All of it collapsed into this single, uninvited moment. Her first instinct was disbelief, a stubborn refusal to let reality settle. This can't be happening. There must be an explanation. But the longer she stood there, the more that hope disintegrated. The room beyond the door wasn't chaos, it was comfort, familiarity. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. Whatever this was, it wasn't accidental. It was practice. Her mind, trained by years of negotiations and crisis management, began doing something strange. It started cataloging details, the time, the place, the absurd normality of the afternoon. She noticed how the soundproofing dulled the noise, how the doorframe bore a faint scratch she'd never noticed before, how the light spilling into the hallway fell across the floor in a thin, accusing line. It was surreal knowing her world was cracking open while everything else remained unchanged. The clock on the wall still ticked, the air conditioner still hummed. Somewhere outside, traffic moved on. And in the middle of it all, she stood unseen, holding the truth in her hands like something fragile and volatile. A lesser version of herself might have burst in, might have demanded answers, might have let emotion dictate the moment. But she didn't, because beneath the shock, something else was awakening, clarity, cold and sharp. Then she heard his voice, not raised, not panicked, comfortable, casual, as if nothing in his life were at risk. And that was the moment disbelief finally gave way to understanding. This wasn't betrayal born from neglect or loneliness. This was entitlement, the casual certainty that he wouldn't be caught, that she was predictable, that her trust was permanent. The words themselves mattered less than the tone, relaxed, dismissive, careless. She felt a pressure behind her eyes, but refused to let tears surface. Tears belonged to people who had lost control. She hadn't, not yet. Her hand moved slowly to her phone, fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. No dramatic angles. No shaking lens, just enough to capture the truth. She didn't need much. 2 minutes would be enough. Evidence didn't require emotion, only patience. When she finally stepped back from the door, it wasn't in defeat. It was in decision. She knew with an unsettling calm that whatever version of herself had walked into the apartment no longer existed. The woman who believed in fixing things quietly had vanished somewhere between the elevator ride and this hallway. In her place stood someone sharper, quieter, and far less forgiving. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, lifted her suitcase, and moved toward the exit without a sound. The door closed behind her with a softness that felt almost cruel. In the garage, the red Mustang gleamed under fluorescent lights, oblivious to the storm it represented. She didn't look at it twice. She didn't need to. She already knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. And for the first time since stepping into that building, she allowed herself a single, steady thought. They have no idea what's coming. She didn't remember how she got into the Uber, only that her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit on them to make them stop. The city blurred past the window, lights streaking like unfinished thoughts, while her body reacted to what her mind still hadn't fully accepted. Betrayal has a strange way of splitting a person in two, the one who feels and the one who observes. She let the observer take control. She asked the driver to take her to her best friend's place, an attorney she trusted not just with secrets, but with strategy. Staying alone felt dangerous. Not because she would fall apart, but because she might act. When the door finally closed behind her, the weight of the day hit all at once. Her friend didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. The video spoke for itself. 2 minutes. Raw, undeniable. Enough to erase any future denial before it could even form. Do nothing, her friend said after watching it. Calm, precise. The way she spoke in court before dismantling someone's entire case. If you confront them now, you lose dignity. You lose leverage. You let them control the narrative. The words landed hard, but they were right. Anger was loud. Evidence was permanent. She spent the night replaying the afternoon in her head, not as a victim, but as a witness. The lies suddenly made sense. The distance, the exhaustion he always claimed. The way she had been reduced quietly to a role provider, not partner. By morning, something inside her had settled into resolve. This wouldn't be a breakdown. It would be a process. And processes had rules, timelines, endgames. That evening she went home. Not cautiously, deliberately. She made noise when she opened the door, called out his name with practiced warmth, even smiled when he appeared too eager, too fast. He hugged her tightly, scanning her face for clues she didn't give. The apartment smelled aggressively clean, windows open despite the cold air freshener clinging to everything. He talked too much, over-explained. She listened, cataloging every nervous tick, every contradiction. When she noticed the bed sheets had been changed, cheap ones, unfamiliar ones, she asked about it casually. He lied badly. A story about spilled coffee, said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She nodded, filed it away, and said nothing. Silence, she realized, was already doing more damage than confrontation ever could. That night, while he slept beside her, breathing evenly, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The man she had trusted with her life now felt like a stranger occupying borrowed space. At 2 a.m, when his snores deepened and his guard dropped, she reached for his phone. Gently, methodically. Years of shared intimacy had given her access fingerprint, passwords, habits. Messages were wiped clean, almost too clean, but hidden apps told a different story. Encrypted chats, transfers, receipts, jewelry, hotels. She took screenshots of everything, sending them to herself, building a quiet archive of truth. By the time she put the phone back, her hands were steady, her heart was cold. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about theft of money, of time, of dignity. And as she turned onto her side, careful not to touch him, one thought anchored itself firmly in her mind. From this moment on, I stop reacting. And start controlling. The days that followed settled into an eerie imitation of normalcy. She woke up early, prepared breakfast, dressed for work, and kissed him goodbye as if nothing inside her had collapsed. From the outside, their life looked unchanged, routine intact, schedules aligned, smiles exchanged on cue. But beneath that surface, She watched him the way you observe someone you no longer recognize. Every gesture felt rehearsed. Every question carried an undertone of surveillance. He laughed too easily, asked too often whether she was tired, whether work was stressful, whether everything was okay. It wasn't concern, it was fear disguised as affection. She answered calmly, never offering more than necessary. The more composed she appeared, the more unsettled he became. And she realized something quietly powerful. Guilt makes people sloppy. All she had to do was give him space to unravel. At dinner, she began planting questions lightly, almost playfully. Small comments slipped into conversation like harmless curiosities. Why had the doorman mentioned seeing the car late at night? Why had her sister-in-law stopped by during work hours? Each question was wrapped in innocence, delivered with a smile, then abandoned before he could fully respond. His reactions told her everything. The dropped fork, the sudden need for water. The way his eyes avoided hers just a second too long. She never accused. Never pressed, she let silence do the work. After all, people reveal more when they're trying to hide than when they're being interrogated. By the end of each evening, he looked exhausted not from work, but from carrying lies that were starting to crack under their own weight. Physical distance followed naturally. She claimed fatigue, headaches, long days. He reached for her out of habit, but she flinched without meaning to, and a moment passed between them like a closed door. He noticed. Of course he did. His insecurities surfaced in subtle ways, hovering in the doorway, checking his phone constantly, pacing when she stayed late at the office. The man who once took her presence for granted was now desperate for reassurance, and she gave him none. Not out of cruelty, but because the truth had already stripped intimacy of its meaning. Sharing a bed with him felt like sleeping beside evidence. And evidence, she knew, had no place in her arms. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, she reviewed what she had collected: messages, transfers, dates, patterns. This wasn't an isolated mistake, it was a system. A double life built on her absence and her trust, and the more she uncovered, the clearer her path became. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and leaves nothing useful behind. What she felt now was precision, control, the steady confidence of someone who knows the truth and understands timing. Living with him wasn't torture, it was reconnaissance. Every shared meal, every staged smile, every forced laugh added another layer to her understanding. He believed he was still acting. He had no idea the performance was already over. And as she turned off the lights each night, she reminded herself of one unshakable fact. The most dangerous phase of betrayal isn't discovery, it's patience. Betrayal, she had learned, always leaves a financial fingerprint. Feelings can be denied. Words can be twisted. But money tells the truth with brutal clarity. Late one night, while he slept beside her, she opened her laptop and began tracing the quiet movements she had once ignored. Joint accounts, credit cards, transfers marked with vague descriptions. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Bills paid, savings intact. But she knew better than to stop at first impressions. Years in business had trained her eye to notice patterns where others saw noise. And there it was, small withdrawals, spaced just far enough apart to avoid attention. Luxury purchases disguised as work expenses. Cash transfers routed through accounts she had never questioned. Each transaction was a breadcrumb, and together they formed a trail that led somewhere she hadn't expected, but immediately understood. The gifts were the most insulting part. Jewelry purchases timed perfectly with business trips she'd taken. Hotel charges during lunch hours. A condo payment hidden under his mother's name. The audacity of it all hit her harder than the affair itself. He hadn't just betrayed her emotionally, he had funded that betrayal with money she earned, money meant for their future. She remembered the nights he'd come home complaining about bonuses being cut, about financial pressure, about how she was so strong for carrying them through. She had believed him. Worse, she had supported him. Transferred money to his account so he wouldn't feel inadequate. Seeing those same funds redirected toward another woman felt like discovering theft layered on top of lies. Her chest tightened not with sadness, but with something closer to disgust. She confronted him indirectly, choosing timing as her weapon. One weekend evening, she cooked an elaborate dinner, poured wine, let him relax into comfort. When his guard dropped, she mentioned a potential investment, a piece of land, a joint opportunity. She watched his face carefully as she suggested withdrawing a large sum from their savings. The color drained from his skin instantly. Panic flashed across his eyes before he buried it under forced logic and excuses. The market was bad. The money was tied up. He'd invested without telling her. Lost almost half. The lie was clumsy, rushed, and desperate. She nodded slowly, pretending disappointment instead of suspicion. In that moment, she didn't need proof anymore. His fear confirmed everything. A man who hadn't stolen would never react like that. That night, lying awake beside him, she no longer saw a husband. She saw a liability. Someone who had gambled not just with her heart, but with her security and future. This wasn't a marriage in crisis, it was a partnership built on fraud. And fraud, unlike infidelity, had consequences that extended far beyond divorce papers. As she stared into the darkness, calculations replaced emotion. Legal leverage, asset protection, documentation. The affair had been personal, the money made it strategic. By the time morning came, she was no longer asking herself why he did it. That question was useless. The only thing that mattered now was how much he had taken, and how much it would cost him to lose everything he thought he controlled. If betrayal by a spouse felt like a knife to the back, betrayal wrapped in family felt like poison, slow, intimate, and far more devastating. Family dinners became a performance she never auditioned for, but was forced to star in. Laughter echoed around the table, plates passed from hand to hand, and across from her sat her brother-in-law, honest, hardworking, completely unaware. Beside him, her sister-in-law smiled with practiced ease, playing the role flawlessly. Watching them together stirred something darker than rage. It was grief. Grief for the trust that once made family feel safe. Grief for the innocence that allowed people to believe blood meant loyalty. She studied their interactions quietly, the casual touches, the coded glances, the confidence of people who believed their secret was airtight. They weren't just lying to her. They were lying to everyone. The moment that crystallized everything came unexpectedly. A necklace caught the light as her sister-in-law leaned forward to reach for a glass white gold, unmistakably expensive. She recognized it instantly. She had seen the charge weeks earlier, buried in a credit card statement. $10,000. A business expense. Her pulse didn't spike. Instead, it slowed. She commented casually, complimenting the piece with genuine admiration, asking where it came from. The hesitation was brief but visible. A lie followed cheap jewelry, online purchase, nothing special. Her brother-in-law beamed, proud and oblivious, agreeing without a second thought. The cruelty of that contrast, his sincerity against their deceit, pressed hard against her chest. She smiled through it, knowing that every lie spoken so easily now would echo painfully later. What shocked her most wasn't their audacity, it was how comfortable they were. The affair hadn't stayed hidden in dark corners. It had seeped into family spaces, shared meals, holidays, conversations about the future. They had normalized the deception, and that normalization cut deeper than passion ever could. She realized then that this wasn't just about desire or opportunity. It was about character. About people who could look someone they loved in the eye and still choose themselves. The affair hadn't broken family ties in one dramatic moment. It had eroded them slowly, deliberately. And she was standing in the middle of the damage, holding the full picture while everyone else saw fragments. That night, as she drove home, silence filled the car like a living thing. She thought about loyalty not as an emotion, but as a decision repeated daily. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped choosing it. She, on the other hand, was done sacrificing for people who wouldn't protect her in return. Family, she understood now, wasn't defined by shared blood or shared tables. It was defined by who respected the lines you refused to cross. And those lines had been trampled beyond repair. As the city lights blurred past her windshield, one certainty settled in her bones. Exposing a lover was painful, but exposing family would be unforgivable. And yet, if truth was coming, it would come all the way. She understood something most people never do. Reputations don't collapse from accusations, they rot from whispers. Direct confrontation would only turn her into the villain, the emotional wife, the predictable stereotype people were quick to dismiss. So she chose a quieter route. One that required patience, timing, and restraint. At social gatherings, she stayed warm, polite, even affectionate. She never complained. Never hinted at betrayal. Instead, she allowed herself to appear exactly as she always had, reliable, composed, trusting. And that, paradoxically, made people listen more closely when small inconsistencies surfaced. A raised eyebrow here, a paused conversation there. She didn't start rumors. She simply created space for them to breathe. It began subtly. At a company gala, she spoke to the kind of people who enjoy collecting information as much as sharing it. Over champagne and polite laughter, she expressed concern, not suspicion. Just concern. A doorman who might be mistaken. Late nights she couldn't explain. A woman who looked strangely familiar sitting in the passenger seat of her husband's car. She defended him as she spoke, insisting it was probably nothing, that people exaggerated. But defending someone too much has the opposite effect. It plants doubt. And doubt, once planted, doesn't need watering. It spreads on its own. She watched it happen in real time, the exchanged glances, the hushed follow-up questions, the sudden shift in tone when her husband's name came up. At home, the impact was immediate. He came back tense, irritated, snapping at small things. Complaining about gossip at work, about people watching him, about whispers that made him uncomfortable. She listened with apparent sympathy, offering advice that sounded supportive, but quietly fueled his paranoia. The more you defend yourself, she said gently, the more people think it's true. The words lodged deep. He started sleeping poorly, pacing at night, checking his phone obsessively. The confident man she once knew was unraveling under the weight of something he couldn't confront publicly. Fear had replaced arrogance, and fear made him reckless. She felt no joy watching him suffer, only confirmation. Reputation, she realized, was fragile not because it was false, but because it depended on trust. And trust, once cracked, never fully returns to its original shape. She hadn't raised her voice or shown her hand. She had simply let the world notice what she already knew. As she turned off the lights one evening, listening to him pace in the next room, she accepted a hard truth. Justice doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as sideways looks, as a man slowly realizing the image he protected so carefully was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The announcement came on an ordinary afternoon, wrapped in forced smiles and casual chatter, which somehow made it feel even more explosive. They were gathered at her parents' house, food on the table, familiar laughter in the air, when her sister-in-law suddenly fell quiet. She placed her hand over her stomach, took a breath that felt rehearsed, and said the words that instantly tilted the room off its axis. "I'm pregnant." Joy erupted around the table. Congratulations flew freely. Her brother-in-law stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, disbelief melting into pride as he hugged his wife. Everyone saw a miracle. Everyone, except the three people who understood the danger hidden inside that sentence. Her husband froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost frightening. In that moment, she didn't need proof or calculations. His reaction alone screamed the truth louder than any confession could. As the celebration continued, she watched carefully. Her sister-in-law smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the expression of someone clinging to a lifeline, not celebrating a blessing. Her husband barely touched his food. His hands trembled when he reached for his glass, his gaze darting anywhere but at the woman announcing new life. To everyone else, his behavior looked like shock or surprise. To her, it looked like panic. A child changed everything. Affairs could be hidden. Money could be manipulated, but pregnancy was irreversible. It carried timelines, medical records, dates that didn't lie. And suddenly, the quiet game she'd been playing entered a new dangerous phase. On the drive home, the silence inside the car felt heavier than any argument. She broke it gently, her voice calm, almost curious. She commented on how unexpected the news was, how timing was such a strange thing. She mentioned weeks, calendars. Her husband gripped the steering wheel harder, his knuckles whitening as streetlights flashed across his face. He offered weak explanations, clumsy reassurance that sounded more like pleading than logic. She didn't argue, she didn't accuse. She simply let the questions hang between them like a slow drip of water eroding stone. By the time they reached home, his confidence had completely collapsed. Fear had taken its place, and fear made people desperate. That night, as she lay awake listening to him toss and turn, she understood the shift that had just occurred. The pregnancy wasn't just a complication, it was leverage. For her sister-in-law, it was protection. For her husband, it was exposure. And for her, it was confirmation that this story was no longer just about betrayal, or even revenge. It was about truth surfacing whether anyone was ready for it or not. She stared at the ceiling, calm and unwavering, knowing the storm ahead would be louder, messier, and impossible to contain. The quiet phase was over. The countdown had begun. The pregnancy didn't unite them, it fractured them. Almost overnight, the secret alliance that had once felt exciting and untouchable began to corrode under pressure. Fear has a way of changing loyalties, and now both of them were afraid, but of very different things. Her sister-in-law wanted security, protection, a future that didn't collapse under suspicion. Her husband wanted distance, silence, a way out that didn't cost him his reputation, his money, or his freedom. Those goals could not coexist. Late at night, whispers replaced passion. Arguments replaced affection. Phone calls stretched longer, voices sharper, patience thinner. She noticed the signs immediately, the pacing, the sudden disappearances, the way his phone never left his hand. The love affair had turned into crisis management, and crisis has a way of exposing who people really are. She didn't intervene directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she applied pressure at exactly the right points, a concerned comment here, a casual observation there. She mentioned to her husband that his sister-in-law seemed stressed, frightened even, that she'd hinted someone was trying to avoid responsibility. The effect was immediate. His face tightened, his breathing changed, paranoia crept in fast. At the same time, her sister-in-law received anonymous warnings messages suggesting she was being abandoned, that promises were dissolving behind her back. Mistrust spread like poison. Each believed the other was preparing to sacrifice them first. And once suspicion takes root, even the strongest lies begin to collapse under their own weight. Meetings followed. Secret ones, rushed and panicked. She knew because she watched not emotionally, but strategically. Locations changed. Timings shifted. The confidence they once carried was gone, replaced by the jittery caution of people who know they've lost control. Inside those whispered conversations were accusations, demands, threats disguised as pleas. She imagined them clearly. Her sister-in-law crying, invoking the baby as leverage. Her husband denying everything, insisting on patience, on silence. Neither trusted the other anymore. The bond that had once fueled the betrayal was now the very thing threatening to destroy them both. And that was when she understood she no longer needed to push. They were doing the work for her. People don't fall apart because of exposure alone. They fall apart because they turn on each other. Sitting alone in her office one evening, watching city lights flicker beyond the glass, she felt something close to calm. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just inevitability. The truth was pressing in from all sides, and there was nowhere left for it to hide. Their alliance was over. What remained were two frightened people standing on opposite sides of the same collapsing lie, each waiting for the other to blink first. And she knew exactly who would lose. The end didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, almost respectfully, the way final truths often do. By the time everything surfaced, there was no shock left, only confirmation. Evidence had accumulated too thoroughly to be dismissed. Timelines overlapped. Financial trails converged. Conversations contradicted each other. The lies, once layered so carefully, could no longer support their own weight. When the moment finally came, it wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Lawyers spoke. Documents were filed. Accounts were frozen. Careers paused, then cracked. Her husband sat across from her in a neutral office, suddenly stripped of charm, confidence, and excuses. He didn't deny anything. Denial requires hope. And he had none left. The fallout rippled outward, touching everyone it had been hidden from. Her brother-in-law learned the truth not through accusations, but through facts, dates, records, undeniable sequences that told a story no one could twist. The betrayal hit him hard, but clarity arrived with it. Lies thrive in confusion. They collapse under structure. Family relationships fractured, not because she exposed them recklessly, but because deception cannot survive daylight. Her sister-in-law retreated into silence, the protection she thought she secured dissolving the moment truth demanded accountability. The child, innocent in all of it, became the quiet reminder that consequences don't choose sides, they simply arrive. As for her, there was no public victory lap. No satisfaction in watching others fall. What she felt instead was release. The kind that comes when you stop carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. She reclaimed what had been taken: her money, her time, her narrative. She didn't need revenge in the way movies sell it. She needed closure on her own terms. Walking away from the marriage felt less like loss and more like stepping out of a room she had long outgrown. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. In the end, the most powerful moment wasn't when the truth was revealed, it was when she chose herself without apology. Betrayal had tried to reduce her to a reaction to pain, to chaos. She refused. She responded with patience, intelligence, and restraint. And that restraint changed everything. Some stories end with forgiveness, some end with fury. Hers ended with clarity. Because the quietest reckoning is often the one that lasts the longest. And when she finally closed that chapter of her life, she did so knowing one simple truth. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she had outgrown it.